Get started in just a second here. I'm still waiting for some folks to join in. All right, so today, kids, we're going to be taking a look at, to start off today's new ism of the day, if you will. We've talked about conservatism, we've talked about liberalism, we've talked about nationalism, and now we're going to take a look at socialism. Socialism is a term that I think that we just need to talk a little bit about here because it's a term that can be confusing for people. In particular, the reason that makes socialism a confusing term is depending on when we're talking about in history, socialism kind of takes on a different form, all right? Now, what we're going to be mostly focusing on socialism in this unit is going to be a particular kind of early socialism known as Utopian Socialism. And I have a reading that you guys are going to be taking a look at today. Excuse me. I have a reading that you guys are going to be taking a look at today that will go over the main contributors to the Utopian Socialist movement of the early 1800s, really right around the first 25 years of the 19th century. More commonly, we hear the word socialism, or even a more radical form of socialism known as communism, associated with a name that you've probably heard before. Its name's Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, along with another guy by the name of Friedrich Engels, Marx and Engels worked together in the mid-1800s, right about the year 1848, which is a big year in European history, of course, because of the revolutions that were happening during 1848. But in 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, these two German political philosophers, released probably the best known work on communism, known as the Communist Manifesto. So before I start talking about utopian socialism, I'd like to just broadly talk to you about the term socialism. What does it mean? How is it different from communism and these kinds of things? So let's begin by just saying this about socialism. Generally, socialism appeals to a group of people collectively known as the proletariat. And that's what this says up here, proletariat, okay? This is a term that you're going to definitely want to commit to memory because proletariat is kind of a fancy word for working class, all right? Why would socialism appeal to the working class? Well, let's take a look at what it is. Socialism, in terms of a political philosophy, is the belief that the government has a duty to the general population, the majority of people living in a place, to make laws that will improve the conditions of particularly those people struggling at the bottom of society, which, by the way, makes up the majority of the population, right? When we say the bottom of society, I'm not just saying the bottom 1 or 2%. I'm saying maybe the bottom 60 to 80% of society, who all more or less toil away in varying jobs in factories, or even in some cases still on farms, doing industrial manual labor. And as we know from the Industrial Revolution, a lot of folks in the working class had seen a significant drop in not only their life expectancies, but generally speaking, just their overall quality of life, both at work and in their own personal lives at home. People were really, really struggling in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. And this led to the group of people suffering from these conditions to begin feeling angry, resentful, and hostile towards the ruling classes, who seemingly had very little interest in doing anything to help these folks out. So socialism was about creating laws, in particular government programs, reforms, that would improve or bring up the tide, referring to an old saying called a rising tide lifts all ships. The idea being that if you bring the bottom part of society up, everybody benefits from it, and that the best pathway to ensuring that change was through governmental reform. Now, I may not have to mention this, but it goes without saying that that the socialists or socialist sympathizers of this time would not have gotten along well with the industrial capitalist ruling bourgeois class, who were really well educated, really well off, had a lot of money, and typically were the ones who owned the factories or various other businesses who employed the working classes in mass. And so when we talk about socialism, we have to understand that it mostly is going to appeal to your working class laborers, the bottom segment of society. The way that this could become a little bit confusing is because I also mentioned to you that peasants, who are also considered working class proletarians, generally are more conservative. Why is that? Well, the fact that they live out in rural areas is probably one aspect of it, because if you were still living in a rural area during the Industrial Revolution, you still had kind of that touchstone with the past. You still felt like I lived on a farm, I missed the olden days, and those kinds of things. For those urban workers who lived in urban areas, though, cities that started to boom during the Industrial Revolution, life was changing and society and the world was changing around them. And they said that we were no longer living in a rustic, place on the farm where people could, have this communitarian spirit and so on and so forth. The only way to engender these changes would be through progress, through making reforms, through governmental intervention. And the reason that the liberals and the bourgeois are not going to agree with that in this time is because remember that classical liberalism is founded on the idea of laissez-faire economics. The idea that the government keeps its nose out of the business of economics and that people are able to operate as individuals and make their own decisions, make their own money, free of government interference. So the socialists coming in at the about a quarter of the way through the 19th century, right around 1825 or so, start to promote this new spirit of extreme progress to move past the growing pains of the Industrial Revolution and create laws that would improve the quality of lives and just in general functioning of society in these urban areas that had been suffering from the effects of industrialization. Now, the story about Karl Marx, who I feel some responsibility to explain to you right now, is far more influential than these other three guys that we're going to focus on today: Louis Blanc, Charles Fourier, and another guy by the name of Henry de Saint-Simon. And the reason that Karl Marx is more significant is because in his book, The Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx makes a prediction about the future with the best information that he had at the time that he wrote it in 1848. The prediction that he made, you have to understand, Karl Marx is not a wizard. Karl Marx is not a clairvoyant. Karl Marx is not a fortune teller. Karl Marx is a historian and a political philosopher. And so the predictions that Karl Marx made in 1848 were made using the best information that he had at that time. And what was the information that he had at that time? Well, he based his political philosophy on the two most important developments in human history that he had seen most recently occur, namely the French Revolution and Napoleonic era, and the burgeoning or growing industrial revolution that had really put the working class population into a very vulnerable position. Now, what Karl Marx did was he formulated this idea based on economics and society. And what he did was he said, take a look at the French Revolution and what happened. He said, before the French Revolution began, you had what was known as a ruling class, what he called the superstructure, if you will, the understanding about how society worked in the pre-French Revolutionary times, being based on feudalism, being based on aristocracy and noble privilege, and the role of the institutions of the church and the monarchy. And after the French Revolution started, we saw a group of people who began to challenge the authority of the existing superstructure. This group of people were an oppressed class, he called them, of the bourgeoisie, who became conscious, who became aware of their oppressed position within society, and then began to fight to change society and overthrow the ruling class. And once this took place in France, the aristocracy and noble privilege and institutions of the church and monarchy were removed from power, and the new structure of power that was formed was created with the bourgeoisie, the liberal ruling class, at the top of society. Karl Marx took this relationship between classes, the inevitability he viewed of class warfare as a result of oppression and unfairness in society, and he said, let's take a look at what's happening now, more recently, in 1848. We've seen decades of industrialization create a new oppressed class. The ruling class is now no longer the aristocratic the aristocratic noble elite. Now it's the bourgeois liberal elite who are oppressing a wide portion of the population of the proletariat, the working class, who he predicted would inevitably become conscious of their oppression, wage a revolution of the proletariat, where the entire working class would bind together in a nationally led revolt to de-seat the bourgeois capitalists and create a classless society that was completely equal, where everybody shared according to their need. Now, we have to be clear about Karl Marx's prediction as having not come true. That is to say that Karl Marx was inherently, from now our current perspective in the 21st century rather, wrong. Okay, Karl Marx's predictions did not happen the way that he thought that they would. That's in part because things happened after Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto that in 1848 he could have had absolutely no idea were going to happen. Namely, the things that started to happen were governmental reforms, particularly conservative-led governmental reforms that kept the existing ruling class in place, while at the same time smoothing over the grievances and making moderate step-by-step reforms that help to improve the condition of the working class and make them less hostile, less angry, and live better lives. So because of in particular in Britain and France and many Western European places, the reforms that started to be implemented in the latter half of the 19th century after Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto seemingly cooled down a situation that was in Karl Marx's time boiling over into the revolutions of 1848. And so Karl Marx made this prediction that eventually down the line, at some point, class warfare was going to be inevitable between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, that the bourgeoisie would lose that war, just by way of being completely outnumbered by the working class, and that the working class would then establish a brand new classless society where everybody lived in peace and harmony, sharing according to their need. This has never happened. However, other forms of communism have ended up taking hold in the years since Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto. Probably the most famous of these communist revolutions are the ones that happened in Russia with the rise of Vladimir Lenin during the Russian Revolution of 1917, which we haven't gotten to yet. But that form of communism really did not pan out the way that Karl Marx had said that it would. Vladimir Lenin, being a communist revolutionary, did not practice a strict form of Marxist communism. He was heavily influenced by Marx. Vladimir Lenin would have worshipped Marx in the sense that he thought that he was probably the most important political philosopher of the 19th century. However, Vladimir Lenin, when it came down to it, when he waged his revolution, it really did it his own way and did not do it the way that Marx said that it would be done. And then, too, the other thing is that just 7 years after the revolution by Vladimir Lenin that resulted in communism taking hold in Russia and the creation of the Soviet Union, which is what Russia was known as all the way up until I was about 7 years old, or maybe 6 years old. 7 years after Vladimir Lenin led the Russian Revolution in 1924, he dies. And a new leader by the name of Joseph Stalin came to power in the Soviet Union. And Joseph Stalin was even farther away from Marx in terms of his views on communism, particularly in Russia. So what we saw happen was, rather than what Marx predicted, which is that a classless society would be created where everybody shares equally according to their need, rather, when the Russian Civil War was over and communism was put into place in Russia, we see the formation of a extremely oppressive government led by a totalitarian dictator in Joseph Stalin, who did not get rid of social classes and instead actually ended up further subjugating the working class population to misery and terror. And so communism, it's one of those things that on paper sounds really nice. Who wouldn't like to live in a more equal society harmoniously with all of their fellow man? The problem is that by merely trying to create a perfect society, you are starting with the wrong ingredients, because society is made up of people, and people themselves are imperfect. I ran up to grab some coffee this morning and saw a homicide investigation going on in a parking lot near my neighborhood. And of course, whenever you see those kinds of things, it's disconcerting and just overall very, very disheartening, because you don't like to see those kinds of things happen in your own neighborhood. But people are not perfect, and that means that society is not perfect, which means that to try to create a perfect society out of imperfect people means that in the name of communism, which is trying to create order and to create this perfect society through control, that as you implement more controls over society, as you try to make it quote unquote more perfect, you also simultaneously and inevitably take away people's freedoms. And so as order and equality are enforced by the government, people's individual rights are curtailed and taken away by the government. And this is why communism inherently never, ever, ever works. It always, always fails. Every single experiment with communism in history has resulted in the failure of communism to create a perfect society. That goes for the Soviet Union, that goes for China, that goes for Vietnam, that goes for Cambodia, that goes for Cuba, that goes for Venezuela, that goes for every single place that communism has ever been tried. It has always resulted in a totalitarian, dictatorial, and oppressive society where people's rights are taken away from them in the name of creating an equal society. But I digress. Let's move back to talking a little bit about this unit, talking about the Utopian Socialists and things of this nature. As a preview to the kinds of things that we will be talking about in class over the course of the next day or two, including today, let's talk about, this is like the next few slides are like a table of contents slides. They're giving you previews of things that we're going to be talking about. So, first of all, a wave of revolutions through Europe started in France in the form of the July Revolution of 1830. Okay, the 1830 revolutions were the first indicator that the Congress of Vienna was not going to be able to permanently get rid of the spirit of liberalism in Europe, because the French Revolution of 1830 resulted in the removal, the overthrow of the Bourbon king, Charles X. Remember that the Bourbon dynasty had been restored after the Congress of Vienna met and Napoleon was defeated. They put the legitimate monarchs back on the throne of France, who were the Bourbons, and Charles X was the king by the time that 1830 rolled around. Charles X is forced to abdicate the throne, and a new king is put into place by the name of Louis Philippe, who I've told you about before, who ironically would himself be overthrown just 18 years later in the revolutions of 1848, which France also fell victim to. And the effects of this revolution, which lasted for 3 days, created a constitutional monarchy. It created a chamber of peers where the upper house of the French parliament was converted from being a hereditary body where people had to be nobles and inherit their position on the chamber of peers into a nominated house where people were selected to be serving in that position in the chamber of peers, even though those that got nominated retained their life memberships once they were there. But then when they died, a new person would be nominated to the Chamber of Peers rather than having their son take over for them. And then we also saw, after the 1830 revolutions, the alliance between the monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church was abolished. And a month later, the Belgian Revolution began against the Netherlands and the Austrian Habsburgs, and the despotic rule of William I. Excuse me, and this resulted in the installment, excuse me, I apologize for yawning. This would result in the installment of Leopold I as King of Belgium, and he will come into our story a little bit later. But also, the Italians, Poles, meaning Polish folks, fighting against Russia. Remember, Russia, during the partitions of Poland, had taken away Polish territory along with the Prussians and the Austrians, and Poland really didn't even exist as a state anymore. Excuse me. And the Germanic people also staged uprisings, but those were ultimately put down and unsuccessful as well. In Italy, we also saw revolts in the Papal States, Parma, and Modena, where Austrian troops were sent in and suppressed all of the revolts there. But even though the Italian revolts were unsuccessful, it nonetheless awakened Italian nationalism. Okay, Greece had already been fighting for their independence from the Ottomans, and their independent state was officially recognized. We talked about the independence of Greece last class. Okay, I'd like to show you this document. If you go to Canvas, in the Files section, you're going to see this document here called Utopian Socialism.pdf. Open that file up, and I'm going to be reading from that now for you. I am going to read most of it, but not all of it, and this will take me a little bit to get through. But this will tell you a little bit about the role of Romanticism, and it will also tell you about the role of Charles Fourier, Henry de Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen, who are the most important utopian socialists that we need to learn about for the beginning part of this next section. So, by 1825, European society had undergone several shock waves of change. The transformation was set in motion by two immense revolutions. One set the pace for political change in the 19th century, while the other radically transformed the nature of economic man. As we have seen, the French Revolution made change the order of the day and helped to instill in man, or at least some men, the notion that change was somehow both good and desirable. Occurring at the same time, although with a varied pace depending on what European nation we are observing, an industrial revolution worked its wonders on nations, social classes, and individuals. Although there were those thinkers who were critical of the Industrial Revolution and wanted to return to some pre-modern state of existence, there were other critics who saw that industry and industrial capitalism were here to stay. For these individuals, it was a forward-looking socialism, which would help make sense of all of these changes for the benefit of mankind. However, it is curious to note that following the Napoleonic period, a strong wave of conservative reaction set in across most of Europe. And we've been learning about that with the Concert of Vienna and the Concert of Europe and the Congress of Vienna, which tried to curtail liberal revolutions. This is not that surprising, since most monarchs across Europe feared what another French Revolution or another Napoleon would do in their country. The first quarter of the 19th century was also marked by an artistic and cultural phenomenon known as Romanticism. The Romantic artist idealized medieval society and, in general, exhibited a strong distaste for rationalism of any flavor. The Romantic also had no sympathy for the atomized individualism that was so prominent among the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Therefore, Romanticism also lent itself to conservative and reactionary purposes. And that's what I've been trying to tell you about Romanticism, is that depending on how we're discussing Romanticism, it's kind of a broad artistic and political philosophical movement that took place during this era that can either be applied to conservatism or be applied to even liberalism or socialism, depending on the context in which we're talking about it, being either a return back to the glory of a pre-French Revolution era where kings and aristocratic nobles ran the show and people lived in small communities where they looked out for one another. Or, alternatively, you could also use Romanticism to describe the overly idealized nature of liberals and socialists of this time, who looked towards the future as being the only way in which progress can be secured. And that a lot of ways in which they looked at the progress of this time was hyper-idealized and probably not very pragmatic. But since Romanticism also meant the attempt to break away from established norms and standards in art, conduct, and philosophy, it could also seem to have served the purposes of liberation that was embraced by the radical and revolutionary socialist. Romanticism was so complex a movement that historians have never reached a consensus regarding definitions or meanings. Romantics were liberals, conservatives, rationalists or idealists, Catholics or atheists, revolutionaries or conservative reactionaries. Their essential message, however, was that the imagination of the individual should determine the form and content of all art. Such an attitude ran counter to the judgments of the Enlightenment. The philosophers attacked the church because it blocked human reason. The Romantics attacked the philosophers because they had turned man into a soulless thinking machine, essentially a robot. Christianity previously had formed a matrix into which medieval man had found understanding. The Enlightenment replaced the medieval matrix with the matrix of Newtonian physics. For the Romantics, the result of all of this was the demotion of the individual. Imagination, sensitivity, feeling, spontaneity, and freedom were stifled, choked to death. Man must liberate himself, like Rousseau. Rousseau, who was himself an Enlightenment thinker, came late in the Enlightenment and is oftentimes referred to as kind of the father of Romantic philosophy. Rousseau, one of the spiritual fathers of Romanticism, the individual must rediscover true freedom. Habits, rules, traditions, and standards imposed by rational society must be lifted. Rousseau was the one who famously said, everywhere man is free, or everywhere man is free, what is the phrase? Now I'm screwing it up. Man is in chains. Man is born free and everywhere is in chains. That's the phrase. Okay, man is born free and is everywhere is in chains, meaning that society itself implements constrictions when everybody subscribes to the same idea, and this ultimately in the long run inhibits freedom, and people don't even know it because they believe society is free, yet they don't realize that there are a lot of other ways in which they are in chains and pawns of a larger context of understanding, the matrix, if you will, of rational society that had been created during the Enlightenment. Man must be liberated from that. The philosophers tried to demonstrate that all men are the same because they are endowed with reason. But where the philosophers saw commonality, the Romantics saw diversity and uniqueness. Discover yourself, they said. Express yourself. Play your own music. Write your own poetry. Paint your own personal vision. Live, love, or suffer in your own way. Whereas the 18th century philosopher would have agreed with Kant when he said, dare to know, the Romantics were the ones to take up the battle cry, dare to be yourself. The Romantics were rebels, and they knew it. They dared to be themselves, and they were most passionate about their subjectivism. In other words, subjective being only applying to that individual, okay? A subjective question is one where everybody may have a different answer to it. So the Romantics are passionate about subjectivism. Their emphasis on the introspective self. After all, had not Rousseau's Confessions begun with the following words, I am commencing an undertaking hitherto without precedent, and which will never find an imitator. I desire to set before my fellows the likeness of a man in all the truth of nature, and that man myself alone. I know the feelings of my heart, and I know men. I am not made like any of those I have seen. I venture to believe that I am not made like any of those who are in existence. If I am not better, at least I am different. For the Romantic, it was poetry which revealed the highest truth. Poetry could do what rational analysis and geometric calculation could not. Poetry could speak to the heart, clarify life's mysteries, and bring the imagination out of the soul. Oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts, said John Keats. Bathe in the waters of life, said William Blake. The Romantics gave European culture an antidote to the excessive rationalism of the 18th century. Intensely subjective and introspective, the Romantics discovered the soul behind the mind. It was in the context of the Romantic movement, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution that the Utopian Socialists made their appearance on the historical stage. The three main Utopian Socialists, Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, and Henry de Saint-Simon, differed from one another in a number of fundamental ways, but they had enough in common to justify talking about them collectively. They all lived at approximately the same time, Only 12 years separated the oldest, Henry de Saint-Simon, from the youngest, Charles Fourier. All were alive between 1770 and 1825, and they all did their most influential work during the first 25 years of the 19th century. Although it was Marx and Engels who eventually labeled these socialists as utopian, as outlined in the Communist Manifesto, they were not utopian in the same sense that Sir Thomas More was. Remember that Sir Thomas More was one of the Northern Renaissance figures we learned about back in the first unit of the class, who wrote the piece Utopia. The Utopian Socialists believed that their ideal societies could be established in the immediate future. Thomas More, on the other hand, could only admit that the island called Utopia was an ideal society, but also that the only way England or Europe could find its utopia was to go back in time rather than forward. So are we focusing on the past or are we focusing on the future? The Utopian Socialists focused on the future. This much said, the label utopian has been accepted, but not necessarily, because historians have agreed with the judgment of Marx and Engels. The real reason why Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen are utopian socialists is because their thought closely resembles that of the religious sectarian, the recent convert, the visionary, and the romantic. This idealized look towards the progressive future. It might also be added that for the modern, the ideas of the utopian socialist also appear to have been formulated by fanatics. This is perhaps a result of the fact that they announced their plans for an ideal society with the same level of zeal as a religious prophet. Appearing as they did in the first quarter of the 19th century, it is necessary to identify the utopian socialists according to how perceptively they understood and dealt with the massive challenge they were facing at the time of industrial society. In this regard, it was Charles Fourier who seems to have been the most utopian of the utopian socialists. What I mean by this is that although Fourier was aware of what was happening in England as a result of the Industrial Revolution, he rejected industrialization wholesale. He despised laissez-faire liberalism and the factory system, not because of what effects they might have on human society, but because he believed that industrial society was a passing phase. He saw no need to rectify the dangers inherent in industrialization. He simply went beyond industrialism by ignoring it. Visionaries can do such things, you know. As a visionary, Fourier's ideas seem quite fantastical and without ground in reality. Indeed, there is much in Fourier's writing that is pure nonsense. Yes, like some of the representations of the early French communist movement, Fourier exhibits that almost characteristic pretension of the revolutionary. He's contradictory. His writings are confused, repetitive, and chaotic, and of course, long-winded. Reading Fourier, after having read Marx and Engels, Fourier comes off as a confused thinker. For instance, Fourier's passion for numbers led him to predict that the ideal world he was helping to create would last for 80,000 years. 8,000 of them would be in an era of perfect harmony, in which androgynous plants would copulate, 6 moons would orbit the Earth, the North Pole would be milder than the Mediterranean, the seas would lose their salt and become oceans of lemonade, the world would contain 37 million poets equal to Homer, 37 million mathematicians equal to Newton, and 37 million dramatists equal to Moliere, although these were approximate estimates. And also, every woman would have 4 lovers or husbands simultaneously. It may be difficult to surmount these difficulties in Fourier's thought, but I think it would be wrong to pass Fourier off as nothing more than an absurd eccentric. After all, even Benjamin Franklin was a bit odd. He believed that men could extend their lifespans indefinitely simply by the power of mind over matter. If one is able to wade through the near endless nonsense which runs rampant through Fourier's writings, one will find that he does offer even the modern reader some fresh and somewhat audacious views of the human condition. If his proposals seem rather extraordinary, if not bizarre by modern standards, his insights into human society and individual psychology remain quite perceptive. Fourier was a relatively isolated thinker. We cannot trace the origin of his ideas with any accuracy. He had no formal academic training and claimed to be bored with the discourses of the philosophers. Working as a traveling salesman during the day and scribbling away in the evenings, he was mocked and ridiculed by his critics. He had no meaningful contacts with any political organizations, nor did his ideas correspond in any clear way to either the early French communists or the British democratic radicals. This is not to say that we must accept Fourier's claim of originality or epoch-making genius either. Fourier tells us that his ideas had tremendous implications for the future. In his parable, The Four Apples, Fourier sees history guided by four apples. The first two, Adam and Helen of Troy, were the bad apples. The good apples, on the other hand, were Newton and, yeah, you may have guessed it, Fourier himself. Newton had discovered the physical laws of universal attraction. It was up to Fourier, so Fourier the illiterate shopkeeper tells us, to discover the laws of passional attraction. These ideas aside, some of what Fourier says does reflect certain rather typical Enlightenment themes. For instance, reason and nature were key terms in his writings. He called himself the Messiah of reason, and like Rousseau, he criticized bourgeois society for having created an unnatural civilization. Fourier proposed a completely non-repressive society, in which basic human drives would not be repressed, but expressed and cultivated. Fourier detested the English for their rapidly emerging industrial society, and for men like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Thomas Malthus, each of which we've talked about in class, and other political economists who had done so much to rationalize that system. He held in special contempt the rationally calculating individualism of the utilitarians, another ism that we haven't yet gotten to. But the utilitarians, for Charles Fourier, were too intellectual, too rational. In their place, Fourier foresaw a community tied together by the bonds of emotion. Thus, Bentham's system, Jeremy Bentham was the foremost known utilitarian thinker of his time. Bentham's system, designed as it was to repress human drive and will, was both wrong and impossible, according to Charles Fourier. Human nature, Fourier believed, was created by God, and organized society should respect that and not try to fight it. Neither could Fourier accept Rousseau's contempt of the general will, nor Robespierre, nor the Reign of Terror, nor even the Jacobins. Charles Fourier was born into a well-established family of cloth merchants and spent the bulk of his life engaged in commerce. But from an early age, so he tells us, he rebelled against his work, lamenting that it was his fate to be participating in the deceitful activities of merchants and brutalizing myself in the performance of degrading tasks. In other words, hating the fact that he had to perform wage labor. He spent his early years in Lyon, in France, where he observed the efforts of the silk workers to organize themselves. Here, too, he observed the rampant commercial speculation, the cycles of inflation and industrial stagnation that prevailed when the free market economy was reestablished under the Directory. Fourier wanted to elevate the status of manual labor, to rescue it from a long-standing tradition of degradation and denigration. But while Fourier was interested in the rational reorganization and efficiency of labor, he by no means accepted the bourgeois work ethic or the older Judeo-Christian notion that work is unavoidably toilsome. For Fourier, all manual labor was arduous and irksome. Whether it was in the factory, workshop, or field, the plight of the laboring population was intolerably dehumanizing. He believed, on the other hand, that it was possible to make all work into play, to make it pleasurable and desirable and deeply satisfying, both physically and mentally. This was perhaps the one vision of Fourier's thought that most captivated other socialist thinkers of the 19th century, including Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. The device which Fourier believed would make possible this non-repressive social cohesion, this Eden of joyous labor, he termed the phalanstery. A typically untranslatable concept, the term was coined by Fourier to suggest the ancient Greek phalanx, where men were tightly linked together, forming a highly interdependent and impenetrable fighting unit. Fourier's phalanx was to become a self-contained community, housing 1620 members, with a myriad of subdivisions designed to encourage a dynamic interplay of various human passions. Why 1,620? Well, Fourier had determined that there are 810 different psychological types. If you multiply this by 2, male and female, you arrive at a figure of 1,620. Here, the law of passional attractions would be allowed to operate unfettered for the first time in history. What Newton had done for physics, Fourier had done for human society. And of course, Fourier believed his discovery to be much more important than Newton's. There are 12 fundamental passions, 5 of the senses, touch, taste, hearing, sight, and smell, 4 of the soul, friendship, love, ambition, and parenthood, and 3 that he called distributed. The first 8 passions are self-explanatory. It is the distributive passions that deserve our closer attention. And I'm actually not going to talk about those. You can read them on your own time if you're curious. But basically, these different passions, he said, would lead people to work together in a harmonious environment where they were working, but working towards fulfillment of their passions. And that each person's own passion intercollectively would work into a happier society that was stronger knit and more efficient. So, jumping down to this bottom paragraph here, when we turn from Fourier to the work and to the ideas and work of Robert Owen, we move into a significantly different historical context. Although Owen was engaged in the textile industry, he was not repelled by his work the way that Fourier was, nor did he live out his life in a abstract drug-induced pondering. Instead, Owen became a highly successful cotton manufacturer and entrepreneur who managed to climb the social ladder into the ranks of the wealthy and socially respectable. Robert Owen understood the implications of industrialization better than Fourier and accepted them in a much more positive way. He was much more open to new machinery, new techniques, and new discipline because he saw these improvements as steps on the road to increasing human happiness. In his earliest days, however, Robert Owen appeared to be little more than a benevolent factory owner who made paternalistic improvements in the lives of his own employees. He spoke a language that seemed to hearken back to a pre-industrial moral economy and a near rejection of modern commercial civilization. For this reason, Owen attracted the attention of the rural gentry and those politicians whose ideas were anti-modern. So he actually comes off in some sense actually a bit conservative because he was trying to bring things back to a more paternalistic, communitarian type of society in the same way that kings, monarchs, the church, and aristocratic nobles were. Owen's reputation grew after 1800 through his operation of a textile factory in New Lanark, Scotland. Owen had introduced such improvements as shorter working hours, healthier and safer working conditions, after-hours recreation, schools for children and adults, moral education, renovated housing, an end to child labor, and even insurance plans that were financed by payroll deductions the same way that our modern-day Social Security is financed, where people automatically, when you get paid, you pay before the money even gets to your bank account. It's taken out from your paycheck and put into a general fund to finance accidents or retirement or whatever. What was remarkable about the New Lanark factory was that Owen not only improved the lot of his employees, he also managed to make profits. Before long, New Lanark became a tourist attraction where visitors came to gawk at Owen's social experiment in efficient production. Owen hated the modern factory system, so he decided to revolutionize it. The factory system encouraged social irresponsibility, destructive competition, and heartless individualism. In contrast, pre-industrial society was characterized by a pervasive social conscience. by a belief that by the upper orders that they had the duty, patriarchal duty, to look after the poor and unfortunate, and by a strong sense of community among the working classes. In his earliest work, A New View of Society, Owen recommended a plain, simple, practical plan which would not contain the least danger to any individual or to any part of society, and which had the goal of making the poor independent and making the poor independent and self-supporting. Although Owen had won the support of the anti-modernizers, it soon became apparent that his ideas and practices had more in common with the democratic radical tradition than with the maintenance of the status quo. In typical 18th century fashion, Owen rejected Christianity and custom and looked to the unique guidance of reason and nature. Owen argued that human nature could be changed. Since we are all products of environment, one only need change the environment to change man. This environmentalism of Owen's became a cornerstone of all socialist theories and programs of the 19th century. This much said, Owen also went on to reject the democratic radical emphasis on competitive individual effort because his personal experience convinced him that it had unfortunate consequences. Owen was no friend of Thomas Paine. Owen argued that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the test of any system, but unlike Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham, he did not believe that the best way to assure human happiness was through the increased productivity of a free market system. Cooperation and harmonious planning would be far superior and far more productive in the interests of society. Owen's first plans for the establishment of a utopian community resembled the phalanx of Fourier, but without the dynamics of the theory of passional attractions that Fourier put forth. Owen called these settlements villages of cooperation. These villages were self-contained agricultural communities where the unemployed could find productive employment. Owen was confident that his villages would spread rapidly because first, they were based on cooperative labor, and second, they could produce more than private enterprise. However, the villages did not take Britain by storm. He couldn't obtain enough capital from the government, nor could he find much help from the private sector. Even working class leaders were suspicious of Owen. After all, he himself was a factory master. By between 1805 and 1815, 15,000 visitors came to New Lanark. The villages continued to show profits, but the idea did not spread. One reason why New Lanark did not work was due to its location. New Lanark was dependent on water power rather than steam, and was filled with workers who had to be literally imported into the area. It was a question of timing, I think. New Lanark was operating under conditions that were typical of the initial stages of textile production, conditions which were being rapidly overcome by the rapidly advancing Industrial Revolution, which became more reliant on steam engines. New Lanark was not, properly speaking, a socialist experiment. Owen and his partners owned it, and he directed it personally with very little democratic input or participation from the workers. Private ownership and the profit motive remained in spite of the more humanistic measures that Owen certainly adopted. Thus, the failure of the New Lanark model to spread was not really a failure of a socialist model, as it was the failure of Owen's own paternalistic humanitarianism. It must also be mentioned that the type of worker brought to New Lanark was of a rather homogeneous type. Scottish workers of Calvinist backgrounds who were inclined to discipline, uncomplaining labor, and self-improvement. In the early 1820s, and thoroughly frustrated with the blindness of the English, Owen resolved to establish a community in America. So in 1824, he sailed for the United States, where he was received in Washington with much fanfare. Then he proceeded to New Harmony, Indiana, where he had purchased a large plot of land. New Harmony was the first and most famous of some 16 Owenite communities that appeared in the United States between 1825 and 1829. None, however, lasted more than a few years as full-fledged socialist communities. New Harmony collapsed when one of Owen's American business partners ran off with all of the profits. Another problem at New Harmony was motivational. Many workers came to New Harmony as serious adherents, I'm losing my voice a little bit from lecturing, serious adherents of Owenism. Others, however, came to dance and sing and play. Owen found that he was no longer dealing with rather hard-working and complacent Scottish workers. The Americans among the Owenites came from a democratic tradition and began to have reservations about submitting to Owen's authority, whether paternalist or not. Owen did not spend much time at New Harmony, and the advice he offered once he had arrived was ignored. When confronted with dissension, he urged the colonists to think about what they were doing. In so doing, they would discover the errors of their ways and become rational. In the end, however, the eternal principles which Owen claimed to have discovered were not enough to keep New Harmony intact. In 1828, Owen gave up his American adventure and returned to England, where he ended up organizing the working classes until his death 30 years later. Then we move on to the last guy. By any careful definition, Claude Henry de Saint-Simon cannot be termed a socialist. The term socialist is associated with his name, though, because his followers, known collectively as the Saint-Simonians, became socialists at a later stage. The details of Saint-Simon's life, and even more so the lives of the Saint-Simonians, are colorful and frequently bizarre, a tendency we have already noticed with Fourier. Saint-Simon was of ancient noble lineage. One of his ancestors was the famous Duc de Saint-Simon, who recorded the daily affairs of the court life under Louis XIV. During his career, Saint-Simon fought alongside Lafayette and the American revolutionaries, and, returning to France, narrowly missed the guillotine. During the Directory, he rose to wealth and prominence, only to lose his fortune, suffer a breakdown, and pass some time in an insane asylum. After his death, Saint-Simonian religious cults grew up, proclaiming that the advent of a new age, the new Christianity, claiming the advent of a new age, the new Christianity, while others of the Saint-Simonians preached orgiastic sexual liberation. By the time of the Second French Empire in the 1850s and 60s, bankers, industrialists, and prominent government officials professed admiration for the ideas of Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonians. Compared to the experience of either Fourier or Owen, Saint-Simon's position in society never really put him in touch with the realities of industrialization. His experience on the Directory is worth noting in this respect, as a friend and associate of the financiers and speculators who flourished during the Thermidorian reaction. He was just the kind of person who was detested by men like Charles Fourier or Babeuf. Where Fourier and Babeuf saw corruption and an almost immoral lack of concern for the common person, Saint-Simon saw expertise and enterprise. Where they had looked to capitalist growth with a suspicious eye, Saint-Simon welcomed it. Where they detested England and its social system, he was an ardent Anglophile, meaning he loved England. And where they were repelled by the falseness and unnaturalness of the Parisian society, Saint-Simon enjoyed the company of brilliant artists, scientists, and men of affairs whom he encountered at the fashionable salons. For some time, Saint-Simon appeared to be a typical liberal aristocrat, a man who spoke a language favorable to the emerging liberal and progressive bourgeoisie. Yet, Saint-Simon was something consistently more than a liberal, more than a simple-minded defender of laissez-faire capitalism. As his thought became more refined, he became more and more concerned with the dangers inherent in uncontrolled individualism. More than either Owen or Fourier, Saint-Simon perceived the ramifications of the new industrialism of his own time, and he attempted to place his perceptions into a broad theoretical framework. He idealized productivity, organization, efficiency, innovation, and technological discovery. However, this does not mean that these ends could be achieved in a free market economy. Saint-Simon condemned kings, nobles, and the clergy as useless and parasitical. That was a familiar enough theme for the period. He believed that in a previous stage of human development, kings, nobles, and priests served a necessary role. It was only now, under new conditions of industrialization, that they had become socially useless. The aristocracy was now an anachronism. Anachronistic or anachronism means out of place in time, meaning it doesn't fit in the current era, and served as an obstacle to the new order which Saint-Simon now saw emerging around him. Even these obstacles, Saint-Simon thought, were to be expected. Had not all recorded history been little more than the record of conflict between one group coming into power and an older group who could no longer maintain its power? While Saint-Simon incorporates the working classes into his vision of the future, the workers do not play a dominant or even important position. While manual labor would be honored and the parasitical orders banned, what would distinguish the new system was not so much labor, but labor's reorganization and the application of technology to it. Thus, the highest positions of prestige and authority would be assumed by a meritocratic elite of intelligence and creativity, the technocracy. Saint-Simon was undeniably elitist. He saw no reason to conclude that manual laborers could, on their own, organize and run an efficient and rational new order. They had the need of the authority and direction of an elite cadre of technocrats. Saint-Simon's ideas lent themselves to various reinterpretations. By 1830, 5 years after his death, his followers split into several factions. Those heading in a socialist direction built upon his rejection of individualist selfishness and rationalism and his concern for social solidarity and interdependent responsibility. They popularized Saint-Simon's ideas and tried to make them more attractive to the working classes. In seeking greater support, the socialists among the Saint-Simonians also began to question the institutions of private property, especially from the standpoint of inheritance laws, whereby the children of rich parents obtained wealth without personal merit or without service to society. Saint-Simon, so think about anyone who inherited all of their wealth from their parents and then just was automatically at the top of society without even having done anything to become wealthy. And the kind of attitude and disconnectedness from reality that would mean for that kind of individual. All right, and Saint-Simon rejected that kind of inherited wealth. Okay, Saint-Simon defended private property as the reward for achievement, but he did not view it as a sacred or natural right. Private property was little more than an institution useful in the organization of industrial productivity. The Saint-Simonians put this attack on the rights of inheritance into the context of a liberation of the most numerous class, working class people, and as a part of a program to enhance productivity. The end of inheritance was not a step towards communist egalitarianism in that sense. So, this gives you a great idea of these early utopian socialists' views on things. Okay? They are not really perfectly organized or uniform. They tend to take on different colors, different nuances to them, depending on who we're talking about within the social utopian movement. Nonetheless, all of them seem to advocate for a communitarian spirit, and that's really the root of socialism, is trying to improve and make the community of workers more efficient and make their lives less toilsome and miserable. Okay, revolutions of 1830. These revolutions of France in 1830 were sparked by a wave of liberalism and nationalism against perceived conservative oppression from the ruling class. For instance, the July Revolution in France of 1830 was the one that saw Charles X have to abdicate or step down from the throne, when he tried to impose absolutism by rolling back the constitutional monarchy that France has or had at that time and turn it back into an absolutist state. And of course, the French population, being largely still angry about the Bourbons being put back on the throne, as well as having spent so long through the years of the French Revolution and Napoleon embracing ideas of liberalism, constitutionalism, and capitalism, you know, they are not going to be in favor of going back to an absolutist monarchy, and so they revolt. There's a radical revolt, the July Revolution, and this forced the conservative reactionary Charles X to step down from the throne. In his place, a new king from the Orléans family became the bourgeois king, Louis Philippe. And Louis Philippe was known as the bourgeois king in part because he supported and was supported by the wealthy bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, the wealthiest financiers, bankers, business owners of France. And he himself, unlike dressing as a royal figure, very much acted and dressed like the upper bourgeoisie rather than an aristocrat, noble, or a king. He made changes in favor of the upper bourgeoisie, but seemingly did not care so much about the interests of the lower bourgeoisie or of the working class. He was very much an elitist. And although Louis Philippe, when he first comes to power, is kind of viewed as this hero of liberal bourgeois sentiments, doesn't do as much as he could have done to improve the lives of the working class or of the lesser bourgeoisie, the kind of lower middle class of France at this time. And since they really got nothing out of 18 years of Louis Philippe's rule, by the end of his reign, when another revolution happens in France in 1848, he had very much lost the support of the French people, having seen him fall short on his promises to make changes to French society, and instead sponsoring the growth of industrialization via the growth of a suppressed working class. And this lost his support by the working class. So, when they revolted against him, he would use force against the workers. He even ended up getting an army to put down the violence and ended up censoring the press. Not exactly the most liberal of policies. And so Louis Philippe is seen towards the end of his reign as being an elitist, number one. Number two, only caring about other rich people who he looked out for, but then very much ignoring the needs of society while creating the conditions that put more people into oppressed labor conditions. So, the Revolution of 1838 was depicted in this painting here, as I mentioned in the last class, which hangs on the wall of the Louvre Museum, Liberty Leading the People, done by Romantic artist Eugene Delacroix. Around this same time, there was a revolution in Belgium. And up to this point in our class, Belgium had not been an independent state. It was previously known as the Austrian Netherlands. And the Austrian Netherlands and just in general Belgium was attached to the Dutch Netherlands. But they were different. They were very culturally different from the Dutch. Number one, the Dutch were Protestant. The Belgians were largely Catholic. Number two, they spoke a different language. The Dutch speak Dutch. The Belgians spoke Flemish or French, depending on where in Belgium we're looking. And so even within Belgium, we see divisiveness because you have the Belgian, the Walloons, as they're known, the Belgian Walloons, and then you have the Flemish Belgians, and they don't really get along with one another and haven't for a long time. Even in modern day Belgium, the Walloons and the Flemish don't get along with one another. But nonetheless, Belgium had never been independent before. But they win their independence from the Austrian Netherlands and from the Dutch Republic, and they become an independent nation state. So there's a Belgian Revolution. It creates the country of Belgium. And of course, Belgium, if you look at a map of Europe, which I believe I have pulled up somewhere here, let's do this map of, actually we can just do this. We can go to more, we can go to maps. All right, and just to show you where we're talking about here, just remember that, I don't know why that pulled up, but anyhow, where is this? That's in Portland, Oregon somewhere. I don't know why that was up, but okay. Let's go over here. Here's where Belgium is, right? And remember that previously these regions, which are known as the Low Countries, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, the Low Countries, were previously run by the Habsburgs. Both the Spanish and the Austrian Habsburgs controlled these areas. The Dutch had broken away in the early 1600s and established the Dutch Republic. But these territories here of modern-day Belgium and Luxembourg largely remained under the control of the Austrian Netherlands until they broke away and were largely controlled by the Netherlands, which they then broke away from in the 1830s and established their own state. Meanwhile, of course, there were some reforms happening in Britain. By 1832, industrial conditions in Britain had started to really go downhill, and the cities were extremely overpopulated. They were miserable to live in. You had disease. You had environmental crises happening. It was pollution and so on. It was really, really bad. And Britain, due to the changes that had happened so rapidly across British society at this time, started to implement cautious new reforms to improve slowly but surely the lives of the working class. And I'm just going to quickly put this video up for you because I'm running out of time, but I would like you to watch this video because it characterizes the changes of the Reform Act of 1832 very succinctly, and will help you to understand some of the changes that happened there. But there's that video. Please do watch that. It's only 8 or 9 minutes long, and that talks to you a little bit more in depth about this slide here, about what kinds of new reforms British Parliament is putting into place starting in 1832. And of course, it would be followed by several different reform acts in subsequent decades. All right, folks, that brings it to the end of class for me today. I just want to say thanks so much for tuning in and listening to me yammer on for a full hour and a half here, basically. And we will pick it up here on Wednesday with the revolutions of 1848. Have a wonderful day.